Michelle?
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called The Value Isn't the Utility. And this was inspired by a conversation at Other Life with Justin Murphy, and Thomas Jockin was there, and some other very impressive individuals. I enjoyed the discussion very much. I think it's an important topic. And we were talking about what is called virtue ethics, which is found, Aristotle, that was the text we were reading. I think actually today it might be useful to talk about value ethics, because people hear the word virtue and they think like old-timey theology, religion. They may even think essentialism as found in Foucault. So then it's easy to dismiss the entire field of thinking and not really think that we have to be concerned about virtues. But for Aristotle, virtue and value is really tied together. And what we value is what we define our virtues relative to. And so basically, if we don't worry about virtues, by extension, that would mean that we either don't worry about values, or our values are simply absorbed from our socioeconomic order, and then we end up captured. Now, it came up in the discussion where in Aristotle it may be assumed or not clear what the first principles are of a given civilization. And in pluralism today, we probably have to choose our own first principles. And it's not necessarily given because people have different first principles. But that doesn't mean the considerations of values or picking values or choosing values for ourselves, like a Nietzschean child, is something that we don't have to do anymore or can even get away with not doing. Because if we're going to have ethics, we are going to have values, even if we don't realize it. In the same way that we'll often talk about the impossibility of autonomous rationality, because it's not possible for rationality to be its own grounding. Nevertheless, people can think it is, and so they'll try to have an autonomous rationality that ends up purely deconstructive. It's a snake eating its own tail. Likewise, if we try to be ethical without realizing that there are valuations that are in play with that ethics, then we will live according to an ethical code that eats itself, that doesn't own its own values and doesn't have an awareness of its own foundation. And that's where you can get into pathologies, neuroses, and different troubles. So this is very, very important. But on the topic of morality today, a lot of people are basically utilitarians. Now, they may not use that term. They may say effective altruism, pragmatists, long-termism, different things. And I'm certainly not against a lot of the notions of these different fields. But part of the problem is it's as if a lot of people feel like these ethical philosophies are possible without valuations, without notions of the good, that the good is given by the result, the positive outcome, the decrease of suffering, that alone means it is good. But if you say it is good to reduce suffering or to reduce poverty, etc., so forth, then you have made an evaluation. Easily a right evaluation, nobody's saying it's a wrong evaluation, but values are in play. And a lot of the paper has to do with the consequences of what can occur if we don't own the fact that we are evaluating, if we're not conscious of that and don't act aware that that is going on.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and it makes me think about how, utility often presents itself as if it's obvious, you
Right.
know? And I think that's, in some ways, it would be great if everything that was the case was just obvious or whatever.
Yeah.
But everything that's obvious is actually only obvious to a particular hermeneutic, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's not necessarily obvious to everybody.
No.
And even the most basic things, or things that you would think would be the most basic, obvious things, there needs to kind of be a substantiation of what those things are and why they are what they are.
Yep.
Not because they aren't ultimately, in a sense, true, but just the fact that you have to approach it more through the angle of the virtues, right? I mean, the idea of it being approached in that direction versus obvious. Obvious doesn't really give much, against substantiation for it.
No. Well, the way to think of it, if you know English, the word cat obviously means the feline. But if you are like Chinese and you don't know English, it is not obvious that that word means feline.
Right.
But you get so habituated, you get so inframed to using that language that it's obvious that that means the feline. But that's actually just because you're so habituated to the language.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to what you're saying on reducing suffering and all of that, a lot of times if it's just about the metrics, then we don't ask by what means.
Mm-hmm.
And, by what means, what if the means actually end up, in an attempt to reach certain ends, they completely are paradoxical. What if they actually,
Absolutely.
It's like, well, there's a surefire way to stop all suffering, just, end the world.
Yeah,
right?
basically.
So it's kind of like, well, it sounds very great. End suffering, that's amazing. That sounds wonderful.
Right.
Tell me what we need to do, And it's just like, well, it's either a mass, universal, say, coordinated time zone suicide, or you blow up the world. And it's just like, that's kind of, it's like, well, wait a second, what do you mean that by like that's not really what we would want in terms of lowering suffering. Now, depending, some people
Sure.
could have that ideology, or viewpoint, but the thing is that we always have to ask, like, by what means? Because
Yes.
a lot of times the means themselves the goal might still be to reduce suffering, but the means by which to reduce suffering actually increases suffering.
Absolutely.
And so it's just kind of an awareness that's there's no way really to just have this kind of like in a vacuum, like as if there's basically always going to be, suffering and no suffering in some sort of like conjunction with each other.
No, it would not follow that, even if it was the case that reducing suffering is always good.
Yes.
It would not follow that a given program that is trying to reduce suffering is therefore good.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, yes, it's always good to reduce suffering. We all want to reduce suffering, but we also need to think about, like, what are the means for that?
Yeah, but then, of course, the problem is what's the difference between suffering and, say, pain, like going to the gym that's good, or pain that makes you more emotionally robust or anti-fragile? You have distinctions in kinds of suffering.
Yeah, like what type of suffering? I mean, I think of, birth is a type of suffering, but then
Yes.
you have, like, new children, so...
Yes. Yes, so it is not given what kind of pains are good and what are bad. What if, for example, you could crash the stock market right now, cause a lot of people a whole lot of suffering, but in the long run you're better off because the economy is on stronger footing. Then again, maybe crashing the economy now because the dollar is so weak would literally just lead to the collapse of the financial system with no recovery ever, in a kind of Keynesian way, where you fall below what I call the demand event horizon. Well, those are all things that would have to be considered. Aristotle is very concerned about the means, weighing, proportion. He talks a whole lot about discernment. For him, the idea of like ethics that was merely a calculation, what reduces suffering, why reduces suffering, why is good, he would find that very strange. And he would say, like, well, my goodness, where's the active thinking? Where's the active deliberation that needs to be going in? And you see, what we've basically done is one of the reasons we've come to be so simplistic in our moral reasoning, which, of course, if you put it the way I just said, no one on planet Earth would be like, that's how we should do ethics. But actually what practically ends up happening is that's how we do ethics, because of how we do our design, our systems, our governments, our programs, etc., so forth. We've all been trained to think of ethics as trolley problems, which is a weird, absurd situation. Like, you're already in the situation, like, where you have to pull a lever or not. How often in real life do you find yourself in a situation like that, where it's preset? You don't. And even if there are trolley problem-like situations, they are very rare. And so, first off, we're trained to do ethical reasoning in special cases that rarely apply. Second, we're taught that it's very binary. It's good or bad. Pull the lever, don't pull the lever. And three, we're not taught to be situational, where to really think in terms of what kind of pain is good, what kind of pain is bad, what kind of suffering is good, what kind of suffering is bad. Yeah. Now, basically what ends up happening is, since we all know, when asked directly, that there are some forms of pain that are good, since we don't have metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, which is all what Aristotle basically claims you have to have in order to do ethics, we then end up having pain defined by the zeitgeist. And you know what pain is good? You know what kind of suffering is good? The suffering of working all the time at a Silicon Valley job. The suffering that comes with personal optimization so you can be better employees. We don't talk in terms of suffering to, say, have a beautiful soul or to have more character. The only suffering and, like, difficulty we're willing to talk about are things that are confirmed by the socioeconomic order. So without Aristotle, you end up captured, just like Deleuze warned. You end up being completely inframed in the Heideggerian sense, and you don't even know it. Because if you're not able to make these moral deliberations on your own terms by your own values, which one you're not trained to create, because You're just trained to think in terms of result and utility and all that, so not the creation of your own values in a Nietzschean sense. Well, then moral nuance, quote unquote, in your life is nuanced by the system. The nuance comes in accordance with the system. And so then you have nuance on good suffering and bad suffering, where the good suffering is whatever contributes to capitalism is what ends up happening. And people don't even realize that's what occurs.
Yeah, exactly. Because the thing that's obvious is actually just like what's at play, like you're saying. So it was arrived at, though, that it was something that did come from valuations. And if there's anything that has values, and it's, we can see that directly with the value of money, the value of, the economic exchange, and those things are, like you're saying, what then determine what it means to be most, to have the most utility, and we also get, it's just a complete, like, focus on, quantity over quality.
Yes.
You're looking a lot more at numbers than you are looking at the actual quality, the actual what it is, and what it's like, and all of that. So, I think that it's interesting because in some ways, to me, it's difficult not to, how you put it so well and so succinctly with the idea of, like, well, even if you had these situations that were, comparative, like, ethical dilemmas, right?
Yeah, trolley problems,
right? Which are always, like, just completely not nuanced. They're in a vacuum.
No.
There's just, two, it's like yes or no. But, even if it were, like, to be boiled down to that, if you had varying situations, you'd have to make a value judgment as to which would be the right decision, or which would be the better decision.
Yes.
And, it's interesting, too, because, you'll have that analogy often about, like, the donkey between the two
yes,
piles.
Yes.
I feel like, I wonder if that is what happens, too, sometimes, where it's, like, just ultimately, even though it seems so practical and obvious and, very, like, it's right and it's useful and this is what we do, it ends up just making people, like, well, because life is nuanced and complex, you're probably going to be more like the donkey. Like, you're just completely. Like, I don't even know. Like, there's these 2 piles of grain. I was taught my whole life that I could just know, and it's utility, and it's like this metric, and I can know what it is. And you won't. And then you're just like, oh my gosh, why am I so stuck? Why do I feel so paralyzed? Why do I feel like I'm never reaching anything? And I'm in between, I'm so close but so far away to the answer,
No, the Burdian, Buridan, Burdian donkey thought experiment is extremely useful. And what you're getting at is why Aristotle is so concerned with, like, deliberation. Like, he has this part at the beginning of the Ethics where he says something like, the problem with youth being involved in political science is that they think their main concern is action, not knowledge. Mm-hmm. And you go, whoa, wait a minute. Isn't the whole point action, mm-hmm. right? Why is knowledge so primary for Aristotle? The reason is because the key is to gain the sense of a pattern to carry between situations. Mm-hmm. The problem is that what he's saying is that the young are only looking for the way to solve this moral problem. They're not learning the pattern that can be taken from this moral problem after you solve it to then apply to other moral systems. Like, they're not looking for mental models. They're just looking for outcomes. And so what Aristotle's like, really the only way you advance ethically. So he also makes a point that the work of ethics is the work of a lifetime. Like, it takes a life for all these things to cultivate and how to have full ethical life. Like, even for Aristotle, if you did, quote unquote, do the right answer for a trolley problem, well, the next day you could be an immoral person because you don't know how to discern the nuance between different likes that people have in a community or something like that, right? So it's the work of a lifetime. He talks about complete virtue. By complete virtue, he doesn't mean something like sinless, like a Jesus or something. He means completing virtue at the end of life, like bringing the garden into fruition, right? Well, that is learning patterns and situations that you then carry into other situations. And that would be what he means by knowledge. And that would also require the ability to discern, to be able to make choices. But this is what happens. If you don't have the ability to discern, which means to see value, to see virtues, then you're always going to be like that donkey. Because you have no way to value one pile, one decision over another, unless the situation itself gives you that valuation. And here's like a key point of the paper is the notion is that utilitarianism works remarkably well for most of human history until you have a prosperous nation. Like when you're dealing with third world nations where it's, say, people are poor or there's sickness and poverty, the very facticity of your situation basically tells you what constitutes right action. Okay, there's someone hungry, the right action is to get them food, right? So the very situation basically tells you what to do. And in that kind of situation, then utilitarianism is practically, quote unquote, good enough of a moral system to get by. Here's the problem. Once you get to first world nations, your situation doesn't so readily tell you what's right action. So you don't know how to do right action. It's just like it's like where Freud said that first world nations needed psychoanalysis, not really third world nations. Because as you entered into first world and you had more leisure, then you had more time to be existential, to deal with yourself, and so on and so forth, right? You weren't always looking outward. Well, the same happens that once utilitarianism succeeds, per se, and creates a prosperous world, it then leaves you not being trained in the ability to find values in environments that don't give you the right course of action by the very existence of a problem. And so then you're the donkey. Mm-hmm. You're unable to make decisions. And so the irony, it's just like where because science is so effective, we're then tempted to overfit science and use it all the time. It's precisely because science works so well that we try to make everything science. Well, likewise, it's precisely because utilitarian thinking, spreading the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, works so well when you're dealing with obvious situations that then you want to overfit it when you need to have a more nuanced and complex ethical system, which is what you're generally going to need in more Western nations, where your very environment doesn't tell you what you need to do so readily. Yes, of course it can. There are poor people, and of course you can donate to third world nations, but in regard to how you love your spouse, how you spend your free time, how you should use your time, utilitarianism will not give you any ethic. And it's important to realize that Aristotle is probably mostly teaching to higher, people that are higher class. They're probably people dealing with leisure. And so and then I'll give it back to you. Like Bertrand Russell was very clear that the problem of leisure was very severe. And then you'll have Niebuhrhauser talk about Scholé and the problem of free time and different things, which is a real problem. If you don't know how to use your free time, then you're going to end up bored, and in boredom, all sorts of problems arise. Benjamin Fontaine was basically like boredom causes wars. Nations become very aggressive when they're bored. Well, if you don't have the ability to say something is virtuous, that something is good, and to discern that for yourself, then you have no ability to coordinate right action. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening. So people don't know how to act. And if you can't act morally, why act? Like if you can't act in a manner that is doing something right or valuable, why bother to act? And so then you have a meaning crisis. Mm-hmm. So then you have the nihilism. So this failure to have an ethical evolution, if you will, or a more complicated ethics, it feeds into the problem of how people spend their free time because they can't discern right action.
Yeah. Well, I think that I wonder if, like, just listening to you speak, Daniel, it makes me wonder if, like, part of our brain just wants it to be simple.
Yes, it does. Absolutely.
So we won't have to think about it, right?
We want the environment to tell us.
Right, but
I think that's why we create drama. Humans seem bent on creating drama because then they know what to do. Then something's happening.
But it's weird because people usually don't know what to do.
No.
But they feel like they know what to do. Like
yes.
If they can just criticize that person, or if they can, or if be criticized. Like they get into that pattern of what can be done. It's like almost having a role, even though it's a sucky role, and then you just keep playing it out.
Absolutely. Well, if you can't discern right action because you can't create values, or you don't know by what standards you would go about doing that, then stuff like self-destruction, self-deception, a lot of the stuff in psychoanalysis become means of coordinating action. Like it gives you direction. Now you know what to do. You know what you need to do to self-destroy yourself. You know what you need to do to tear somebody down. Like the negative is much more obvious than the positive. It is much easier to know how to destroy a sandcastle than how to build one. It's much easier to know how to destroy a painting than to paint one. And so in the absence of value ethics, of which we've been left in due to utilitarianism, we can't coordinate action. And so we end up coordinating destruction.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that, you said about the circumstances changing and that we don't know. The thing is that the whole idea of virtue was that it's something that is inside of you, Mm-hmm. So it's not, it's more about the fact that you cultivate something inside of yourself. Yes. Like there's something about this idea that if you that's why thinking is important, right? And it matters so much, because that's what you carry into all those situations. You know what it is? It's you, right?
Yes.
You don't carry anything else into those situations but yourself, right? And you certainly don't get like a playbook for life, and also the circumstances, like you said, like they will. This is also why we probably like systems and like systemized sort of environments and stuff, because then we aren't like caught off guard, No. If it's systematized, then we can just kind of stick with the utility, But if it's not the system, if it's outside of the system, then you can't just go with the utility, because that doesn't always work, But the thing is, you'll want it to work, so you'll just sort of ram that as the answer, even though it isn't, and sort of hope that it is somehow going to do the job or whatever. But really, like it's not something you have to kind of come into it with a new like every single time.
Yes.
It has to be a new encounter. It has to be kind of a new encounter with the situation in its particularity.
Yes.
Because that's going to be very variable,
yes.
right? But you are not variable in the fact that whatever you're cultivating,
yes,
that's whatever you bring to all these situations. And yes, your cultivation will probably change over time, and hopefully get better. That's all. Yeah, the garden gets more robust and healthy and strong and abundant. And so that's going to be what you take into every particularity.
Oh, no, I think that's what I was saying. Well, if you can't solve a situation once and always solve it, then you could get it wrong the next time. So there's an existential risk. We want to believe that if we solve it once, we solve it forever.
We solve it forever.
Because then you're safe. You're safe. But if you say no, just because you got it right today, you might get it wrong tomorrow. Well, that means you have to be active. Mm-hmm. That means you have to be on your A game. And we don't want to do that because we could fail, and we don't want to fail. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, the reason why we look toward result is if you say, oh, the metric that you spent your time well in writing a novel is that it sells well, then you're like, okay, yeah. But if you say the reason you wrote a novel is because you valued it for yourself, what does that even mean? Like, you have to know what that means. Yeah. And that's not easy to know, except when you look back and you think of all the high order effects it had on you, the doors that it opened, how it clarified your thinking, how it developed you as a character. But then you might a little voice in your head might be like, you're just telling yourself that. It was a waste of time, and you know it. And you have to fight that, and you have to believe in yourself. Yeah. So if you can't outsource... So external metrics give you a way to avoid the internal battle.
Yeah.
And if you can just outsource it to the result and say, look, we, reduce poverty by 10%. Never mind that we don't go in to see the unintentional consequences of dependency or how we're defining poverty in a manner that actually just hides the poverty, because what we did is just change the number on the government statistics so it's not there anymore. Never mind that. Right. But you see, if external metrics help you avoid the internal battle. Yeah. And this is why, in Aristotle, so much of ethics has so much to do with character, soul, internal resources, and different things. And you can't be ethical unless you're able to engage in internal battles.
Yeah.
Because basically the ethical life, if it's not based on metrics that are external, must require a certain trust in the internal self that has to hold to itself. And so character becomes very, very, very primary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking a little bit about this interesting kind of relationship to suffering, which I know we touched on, but this idea of being able to accept that, in a sense, even all the things you see in the world that you want to stop are actually very much a part of your own ability.
Yes.
And capacity.
Yes.
Which is terrifying.
Yes.
Terrifying. We'd rather not like to think
yes.
about that.
Yes.
And so it's easier to just think of it as this sort of, boogeyman out there, sort of terror that we can just sort of know how to just completely extract and rid ourselves of,
Yes.
But what we don't realize is that, as much as I too want to stop all of the evils in the world, you may be getting rid of humanity itself. And so it's which is just a real thing you have to consider. The work done inside is also to fight the outside terror.
Yes.
Because ultimately we are all very capable of the terror.
Yes.
And so if we realize that, we realize, oh, wow, actually, me doing this inner work, like we're talking about, this cultivation, character development, etc., is actually going to be a part of me fighting the big bag boogeyman out there that I'm trying to create these utilitarian solutions for. It's like, it can't just be outsourced. Because I think a lot of times utility it's a kind of, in a way, it is a type of outsourcing to what works, right? This sort of like,
yes,
just set of what you do or whatever it is. And like you're saying, then it's like, well, then you don't really have to work on yourself.
no,
But working on oneself is the very thing that actually addresses, in many respects, at least contributes to an addressing of the woes of the world, really.
well, I mean, Mother Teresa had that line where she's like, if everyone went home and loved their family, the world would be fine. Like, if everyone did that.
Yeah.
There is absolutely something about utilitarianism that, now, in a few more things. One, if you have a country where people are dealing with drought, there is a very safe, it's fairly safe to assume that a program that would, say, give the people in that country access to food and water would do more good than harm. Because there's a shared intelligibility of the situation due to the shared facticity. These 10,000 people are dealing with a drought, therefore there's a high probability that bringing water to these 10,000 people will help them versus not. So even if that doesn't apply for all of the people, it's probably going to apply for 98% of the time. That's why utilitarianism is perfectly fine as a principle when dealing with situations that are given by the facticity, because the facticity erases nuance. Do you understand what I'm saying? Here's the problem. As you have prosperity, or suburbia, or middle-class life, then the problems that people face are individualized.
Yeah.
And they're particularized. What it means to love, it's like you could bring in Gary Chapman's love language, and the paper mentions that. Like, what it means to love your wife, to love Sarah, is different than to love Elizabeth. So you can't have a general principle of loving your wife as a good, because there is no quote-unquote wife. There's only Elizabeth, Sarah, so on and so forth, right? Yeah. So as you get into prosperity, or as you get into situations where the facticity does not give you the problem, the quote-unquote problems are internal. They're the stuff of mental health. They're the stuff of psychoanalysis. They're the stuff of particularization. And utilitarianism cannot help you there.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And I think that the point you've been bringing up is so important about this idea of, like, when things are just, the obvious, if there is an obvious, would be where it's like, well, it's a drought.
Yeah, it's given by the environment.
Like, well, I need to go pick the harvest now, otherwise we won't have food to eat. This is very clear,
Yes.
And so we can't ever throw out things entirely. So there can be things that are more, obvious, or, just
the problem
discernible.
is autonomous utilitarianism.
Sure,
like using
or autonomous obviousness, or
yes,
whatever. Like, and that's the thing I was going to say too. Is and you address this in the paper, but like this idea that it's not that the concept of something having utility is bad. We certainly function in the world with a sense of utility and a use of utility on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Philosophy without some kind of pragmatism is nonsense.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. And so it's like, it's not to throw utilitarianism or utility under the bus.
No.
It's to question autonomous utilitarianism, and also to bring to the forefront of the conversation the interplay between value and utility, and virtue and utility. Because the thing is that, like, a lot of things that ultimately are virtuous have their utility,
Yes.
But a lot of times utility as this kind of, it is an abstraction. If it is an autonomous utilitarianism, it becomes devoid of value judgments. It becomes this kind of, like you said, thoughtless of obviousnness, right? Which is what's problematic, because we can't say that everything's obvious to every other person.
And it's not obvious.
And it's not. And we live in a pluralistic age. It's much even more difficult to have these shared intelligibilities, like you'll talk about, right?
Yes.
Like, it's even more difficult.
Yes.
And we have we do have more prosperity given certain technologies. So now we have, it was kind of on all sides. It's really going to not be a strong enough, set of tools or whatever, even if it can even be called that, in terms of thinking about the world and one's, one's experience
you could read, a book like Applied Economics by Dr. Soul, and basically the likelihood that a given government policy to correct a problem drops like a rock the higher the scale, right? It's more probable Rustberg will be able to fix Rustberg than Virginia fix Rustberg, and then the federal government fix Rustberg.
Yeah.
He talks about first order, second order, and third order effects, and a lot of efforts to say reduce poverty end up unintentionally worsening poverty, etc., so forth. Not always, and that doesn't mean government can't do anything ever, but it's to keep in mind that metrics trick you. Sure. You think you've got the right metric, you think you're paying attention to the right variables, and you're not. Now, the whole idea, as I understand it, of effective altruism is to use computer modeling and statistical analysis and different things to reduce unintentional consequences of different things. And by all means, that sounds lovely to me. But let's say, theoretically, effective altruism dealt with every single situation that was causing trouble and suffering due to facticity on planet Earth. Well, then you would pack your bags and say, all right, effective altruism did its work, and you'd walk away. And if that was your only concept of morality, you now have nothing by which to deal with your marriage or to deal with your community or to decide what you're going to do today. Like, ethics is gone now. So how do you determine right action? All you have is arbitrary action or preference or or it feels good. The only metrics you'll have for decision making will not have a certain rightness to them. They'll just have an arbitrariness to them because you're doing it because you feel like it or you want to. But you won't be able to claim that it's right or it's fitting or you should do it. The language of Aristotle is fitting. Ethics is teleological. The best harp players should have harps. You shouldn't give harps to everyone. You should give harps to harp players because it's fitting, right? And for him, that's ethical. There's an ethical basis for it because it's fitting for harp players to have harps. But if we don't have a concept of character, then we can't say some things are fitting for us or not, or that there are things we should do or not. And we won't have this entire tradition of ethics that could help us feel like our decisions are not just arbitrary and on a whim. Because if they feel arbitrary, then one day we'll just wake up and say, what's the point? Ergo, the meaning crisis.
Yeah, two things came to mind. One is that it's interesting because ethical problems are often kind of these crisis moments or these really kind of difficult, high pressure, adrenaline type of situations. And so we often don't think about how those relate to I'm bored on a Tuesday afternoon.
For Aristotle, ethics is every day.
Yeah, but the ethics as every day is really, really important to shift the mindset because like you mentioned, like so many horrible things are just bad decisions,
yes.
are just because people are bored.
Yes.
And or they couldn't think of something better to do with their time or with themselves. And
yes.
Unfortunately, people aren't always taught very well about those things. So I understand. Sure. I can sympathize with why that can happen. And, we've probably all been there. But the thing is that, like, there's a way in which understanding what to do with time seems to be about that. Like, that's ethics. And so, like, just the fact that you could get up in the morning and make certain choices about whatever it is, making your bed or starting breakfast for your children or whatever it is, having some sense of like order for the day, whatever it is, that like, and how you then use your free time, to cultivate friendships or relationships or work or whatever. These things matter to the ethical, to these kind of, like I was saying, these high adrenaline moments, because actually a lot of those high adrenaline moments happen because of just not understanding ordering in one's own just daily life. Now, like, some like trolley problem or something. Those are those strange scenarios can be so abstract, and you're kind of like, I don't even know if that can come from boredom per se. But you get what I'm saying. A lot of times, like the more very tragic, vivid examples of like ethical dilemmas come from like the quotidian, just the very basic daily repetition. Yes. And so, that's, to me, that was interesting.
Ethics for Aristotle happens every moment of every day, second by second. And we have been trained, exactly what you said, to think of ethics as something that happens every now and then. Yeah. Time management is ethics. Time management is ethical. And the way you use your time is an ethical act. And that's what Aristotle really wants us to understand. But that's not, we think it's arbitrary. You like to spend your time X way, I like to spend my time Y way, and it's just whatever. It doesn't matter. Now, when you're in an when we're in a trolley problem, then we both need to not pull the lever or pull the lever. Like in the trolley problem, our individual differences go away. There's an objective right and wrong, or so forth, or can be posited. But when it's your daily life, it's just whatever, man. Whatever you want to do. Aristotle would vomit.
Yeah, and also with that, like we bring up boredom, but also another thing that's very crucial to look at is stress, right?
Yes.
Because that's another area that can get us that can get people.
Absolutely.
Because if people feel very stressed, they are more likely to find escapes. Like they feel they don't have enough time.
Yes.
So they look for ways to have some sort of relief or sense of timelessness or sense of like, in the bad sense. Usually I think of timelessness as like, they're very good, beautiful, incredible, sort of,
Sure.
virtuous timelessness that's really important to enjoy and cultivate but there's a way in which sometimes it's like you feel like your time is being taken so much by your obligations that you somehow want to get some of it back somehow. And I think this is another thing that's talking about the ethical of the quotidian, because if people feel stressed constantly and they feel like they're never having a sense of time that is of their own. Now, this would also speak to the capture, right? Where you've got, jobs and the capitalist kind of corporate, cognitive machine type of vibes on that. You kind of feel the sense of like, it's a kind of frustration and desperation that I think can lead people to doing things that are actually unethical, right? And would be very much more clearly unethical because of all of the quote the daily repetition of the stress of I feel like this, I feel completely horrible because I'm doing this thing that I can't really, my soul can't bear it, but I feel like I have to, or whatever the reason is. Now, like, there can be something to the idea of like it being kind of in a sense an honor to do a job just because you like in the sense of duty, right?
Sure.
We can talk about that. That's a separate thing. But this idea of feeling like you've sold your soul to like to the corporations or to the 9 to 5 or to the to the social script of what you should be doing with your life.
Yes.
And really there could be another way. There could be. To me, that's where it's like it's not simply boredom; it's also stress, and then that means we use our time as in a form of a way to escape. That then can be like, oh, well, that all seemed like we wouldn't call that unethical. Stress doesn't seem unethical, right? But yet can feed these very like bursty, unethical decisions or choices that people do. And to me, I'm just like, oh, that's so interesting.
When people think that thinking is always stuck on this side of a phenomenon and they can never cross the noumenon, then we stop thinking, because what's the point? Yeah. It loses its weight. And so then we don't think, and then one day we have a nihilistic breakdown. Likewise, if the choices of your life and how you live are just arbitrary preferences, and it's all arbitrary, then one day you have a breakdown.
Yeah.
But Aristotle suggests that what you choose today matters. In the same way that Hegel suggests that no, thinking is participating in the absolute, Aristotle suggests that the choices you make in your daily life are ethical. Therefore, they have weight. We don't think about our daily choices in the way that we use our time as ethical actions. We think of them as just preference or desire or want.
Or just what's happening.
Or just what's happening. So basically it's arbitrary. Yeah. It's basically arbitrary. In the same way that Kant can leave us with thinking that's arbitrary, what has happened is we have ethical systems that leave decisions, the quotidian, as arbitrary. And then so people blow up. So there's a few things. One, in the ancient world, like when you're talking about stress, that's kind of like unethical. Like that's an evidence of a disordered soul. Mm-hmm. Now, in the same...
Or a disordered society or something.
Yes. Now, this is why, this gets into why Aristotle is so complex and nuanced and discerning. There's a difference between duty, which is good, and then a certain kind of obligation, which is you're being controlled. Mm-hmm. Then there's the benefit of pressure that can make you rise to an occasion. And you have to discern those differences. The only way you can discern them is the impact it has on your soul. Mm-hmm. But then you have to be able to discern your soul. And here's the key, ethics in Aristotle is so much tied to fittedness. What is fitting for you to be doing? Well, that's relative to who you are and what you're good at and what you're capable of and what you can handle. But you have to know all those things and discern all those things and then make decisions on, okay, you're good at harp playing. Well, the harp you need to buy is $200. You only have $100. Would it be fitting to get yourself into debt? Maybe, maybe not. Would that be the right course of action? Well, you'll have to go through all that. When you have like stress or constant stress, that in a manner of which shows the inability of people to make decision or to discern, that would be an evidence of an inability of someone to determine what is fitting, or they're clouded in their judgment. And basically we have a society of people that are constantly in stress. And that would all, for Aristotle, be evidence of people not cultivating their garden correctly.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think the tricky thing is that a lot of times people are feeling stressed, okay, and then if like let's just theoretically say somebody were to hear like, oh, I'm not like cultivating my soul, and yet they're like, but I they almost feel like they're the victim to the stress.
Absolutely.
And to the society that has these certain whatever you want to call them, and I think though even a victim mentality is also actually a byproduct in many ways of some types of societal ideas of things, right? Whereas it would be like, okay, it's not that, this isn't meant to be some sort of like personal attack of like, oh, you're stressed? Well, you're stressed because it's your fault. Like, I guess what I mean to say is like...
But it could be.
What I mean to say is like, we take it that way because of how things are framed.
Yes.
How things are framed by a certain, narrative of the society, right? That if you say you're stressed and that's actually your responsibility, people just take it as like, well, now that's a double whammy because I'm already stressed and now it's my fault that I'm stressed.
Yes.
Like, what gives?
Yes.
However, I think if we go back to Aristotle and we go back to like this concept of cultivating the self, there'd be a way in which you could hear that and it not be it's my fault, this is like victimhood mentality, screw this, it's not my fault, like, middle finger, but more so this idea of, oh, I actually have value enough in myself that I can recognize that I have done something or maybe made a choice or allowed something that has made me feel stressed, that I need to I need to adjust, I need to reorder, I need to whatever. So I guess what I'm going to say is like there's such a inability to parse the personal, like this kind of almost personal attack, right? From just merely an assessment of, do you value yourself enough to not put yourself in situations or circumstances? Now, there's going to be the normal stress of just, there are going to be stressors in life. Stress is not necessarily always bad, actually, but the perpetual kind of like stress that we're talking about in this sort of mindset of stress that then actually affects your soul. Like, we can see it in a way that's actually like your responsibility, and that's empowering, not victimhood.
The issue is that in classical thought, there was a real close attention to the very subtle differences between certain emotional states, words, and different things. So, for example, do you feel, when you say stress, for someone in late capitalism, stress is this kind of flighty, overwhelmed, tasks, emails kind of thing. Yeah. Is that the same emotional state as someone who's hungry during a drought?
No.
You could call it stress, but it's not really the same, right? Someone, you could say suffer. It seems like the person in the drought is suffering, whereas the person who's got a bunch of emails and jobs to do is more so in stress, right? Okay.
Or
overwhelmed. Aristotle would be like, that's a very big difference, and we need to pay attention to that difference. Because stress would seem to be a result of an individual who has not properly ordered their lives, their tasks, or figured out what they should be doing and what they should not be doing.
Right.
A lot of times stress is a result of the inability to say no, where people can't say no and they end up in a lot of things and they can't do them all. And then also maybe their boss tells them to do things and takes advantage of them and they never stand up to it because they're afraid that they'll get fired. And so there are these mixed things that then one day people wake up and they don't know how to get untangled. But then Aristotle might be like, well, the thing that you're unable to escape was a result of a gradual series of decisions that led you to that entanglement.
Well, see, but I think this is kind of important because it's this difference we're making between like the totalizing utilitarianism,
Yes.
which is a lot about externalization.
Yes.
And yes, like generally we always have internalizing and externalizing, but basically just this idea of kind of it's out there,
Yes.
or it's out there, and now we found our little program. This is our utilitarian idea of how we're going to achieve X goal, blah blah blah. So there's that. Okay, and then there's the value virtue, which is the internal work.
Yes.
That then has these manifestations on the outside,
Yes.
right? What you're saying is really important, because instead of it just being constant blame, it's capitalism's fault,
Yes.
it's my parents' fault, guess what? You don't have unfortunately, you don't have a choice over a lot of those
Indeed.
things, your circumstances.
Indeed.
The only thing you have, an ability that's actually in your hands, if you will, is yourself, right? So, and also to shift it from being just the blame to what can I do differently? Can I do something differently?
Yes.
That ultimately, like, I think there's a lot of sense of trying to take the power back and being a victim somehow, and just blaming the external circumstance, but rather you're disempowering yourself. If you shift the focus to value, virtue, what can I do, the inner work, the cultivation, all that, it's like, that's the real empowerment. But it kind of gets, it's harder to kind of get, in a sense, you have to sort of get that started
but this
yourself, like revving an engine or something like that.
But this is where Aristotle emphasizes a complete life, a complete virtue. Because if we have like a utilitarian mindset, we're like, well, I can't do something today to change my life, therefore I can't get the result, therefore I can't act ethically. That's what ends up happening. Where for Aristotle, it's like, well, can you make a gradual step today not to scroll your phone as much? And if you think, and it's like if you did a bunch of things over 10 years, then you could get anything that can compound over 10 years would be virtuous. Whereas in a utilitarian mindset, it's basically, the mindset is like, what's the result? And you're like, well, no, you probably can't do something right now that would change your entire life. So in our mind, we go, well, therefore I can't make a right action now, because we don't have a compound mindset. We don't have a cultivation mindset. And if we can't get the ethical, if we can't get the assurance of an ethical outcome, that's the other thing. We want the assurance that, say, learning to not be as addicted to our phone will, for example, lead to us having a transformation in our life. Well, that can't be guaranteed. You don't know how the garden is going to grow. But the very fact that it could would be, for Aristotle, a value judgment, of which would then make it ethical. And the big thing for Aristotle as well, that he's basically saying, we don't think this way. We need to think this way. The choice to spend 10 minutes scrolling through your phone or not is an ethical decision. We don't think of it as an ethical decision. We think of it as a bad use of time. That Aristotle wants to up the ante. It's not merely a bad use of time. There is a sense in which it's unfitting for the human person to spend a ton of time scrolling through their phone without purpose. Now, if you're going through your phone because you have friendships that you are cultivating, well, then there's a telos. So therefore, it's fitting. But a just kind of scrolling, which you've talked about. There's a difference between scrolling and purpose and using phones and things for business. Well, Aristotle will be like, yes, you're now thinking about how those things are being fit into a schema. But it is unfitting for a human being to do anything that doesn't fit into something. And that would actually be, in a way, unethical. It is unethical for the human to waste humanness on doing something that is not fitting for what is human.
Right, and that's all very good. I mean, I think that, to me, the question comes to mind of like, well, what if we put that scenario and then put like a little, versus, the utilitarianism argument.
Utilitarians would say it's not hurting anyone. The utilitarian would be like, it's not doing anything bad.
Utility unto, like, the market. Well, it's great you scroll on your phone. You're probably going to run into some more ads.
I mean, you could make that argument. Sure. On the personal level, the utilitarian would be, maybe you could do a Peter Singer thing where you say, well, somewhere in the world a kid is suffering right now, so you're unethical not to be helping that kid.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I guess what I mean to say is that maybe so a proponent of, like, a more... utilitarian mindset might listen to what you just said on Aristotle and the fittingness, fittingness, and be like, yeah, that's exactly what I believe. Like why what makes the distinction? Because as we said, the value and the virtue are going to actually end up being very, like, having a lot of utility to them. But what makes a distinction? Like what, like I said, if somebody just listened to be like, and maybe it's just case by case scenario, sometimes they'll be like, I agree wholeheartedly. And then sometimes they'll be like, I do not agree wholeheartedly. So it probably is a difficult thing to talk about. But what I mean to say is like, what's the big verses in terms of what language would the utilitarian think of for scrolling on your phone?
If a utilitarian were to hear all of that and say, I agree, then they're a utilitarian that is engaging in value ethics without realizing it. Because they have made a valuation that is a good use and fitting for the human being.
Or maybe they're like, I'm a value ethics utilitarian.
Well, actually, the point I made, most utilitarians or people who claim they're like effective altruist long-term, they actually are smuggling in virtues and values without realizing it. But the problem is that they do that and don't own it. Therefore, they create the impression you don't need to do that.
And this is where the main problem comes in, where it's like, to say utilitarianism can work, we don't need virtues and values.
Yeah, that's
and
the problem.
It's just like, well, wait a second.
That's the problem.
That was a bait and switch right there,
It would be like saying all we need is rationality, we don't need non-rationality. Yeah. Well, then you're doomed. You're in game theory dynamics.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, the Beatles song was coming to mind where it's like, all you need is love.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like, well, okay, that's great, what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Who decides that?
Yeah,
how do you feel loved? It's like
if you say all you need is what's practical. All you need is what's practical. Who defines practical?
Exactly,
according to what standard and metric?
And again, with the scrolling phones, so much of utility would be captured by the market. So scroll all you like. Because you might run, like I said, in a sense, to keep you on the platforms is exactly what.
But actually, the point you're making is quite good, because there's one way in which some people would say, well, actually, that's good utility because they're gathering your data and they'll be able to give you better results. Like when you log in, you won't have to search as much because they'll just automatically through the algorithm.
Your feed will be fitting to you.
Yeah, that's correct.
Fitting.
That's correct. So this is where Aristotle will come. He's like, and that's exactly why utility is not enough, because you have to determine which utility according to which standard.
Which fittingness. What are we fitting ourselves to, and what's being fit to us?
That's exactly right. Now, most true, that's a dangerous term, but a lot of utilitarians would probably take the route of saying something like, it's not harming anyone, therefore it's good. Because basically the ethic today is utilitarian and consent ethics, where it's like,
does it harm anyone
or not?
Well,
and that's a form of utilitarianism.
I wonder if utilitarianism also gets extremely, in its, most kind of, I keep forgetting the word that I want to qualify that with, but oh well.
That's all right.
The kind of totalizing utilitarianism that says explicitly,
autonomous.
No, we don't, autonomous, thank you, that's the word.
Yes.
We don't need virtues and values. Oh my gosh, now I lost my train of thought. Okay.
That's all right. And I will just note, look, utilitarianism is a term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. Exactly. It's a term we are using, and a lot of people, well, that's not what Mills, they had nuance. That's fine. That's all fine. But basically, it's ethical system. It is a term we are using here to refer to the ethical idea that what is ethics is what does the most good for the most people. And that's all. That premise is all you need for ethics, is basically what is happening, and that leads you to results, metrics, utility, all of these different things.
And you're saying that mindset often comes, that goes hand in hand with, we actually don't need virtues and values?
Absolutely, you don't. You just need to see if pain is reduced. If pain is reduced, if starvation goes down, if poor people have housing, if there's peace on earth, then we're good. You don't need values and virtues to determine that. You can see with your eyes if there's poverty.
Yeah, that's really
it's empirical.
But that's really interesting though, because that would probably work if we were animals, right? Like what I mean to say is it's a baseline of are people fed? Do they have a home?
Sure, right? That's what I'm saying. It's very low level. It's very first order.
It's I think anyone could agree with that. But we're as human beings, we also have emotional needs.
Yes, but the reason why utilitarianism or philosophies like utilitarianism have worked for most of history is because for most of human history, we have basically been like animals in quality of life. The quality of life.
Yeah, we had to contend with nature, and we had to just
it wasn't
until
McCloskey will talk about the Great Enrichment started in 1670, where then now we have a whole new boatload of problems, and you need to have an ethic that reflects that.
Yeah, I remember what I had forgot I was going to say, which was that I wonder if it becomes a lot more murky, the concept of utilitarianism in an internet age, because how you said it's not harming anyone, right? Yes. Well, actually, it's interesting because there can be very, very good cases, and they have a kernel of truth in what they're saying. At the same time, it's not always thinking about the soul, right? No. It's kind of these things on the internet, they don't really hurt anybody. It's not doing anybody any harm. okay, but that's why it gets even more difficult to make the discernment, right?
Completely.
Because it's like, well, that's true. It isn't really harming anybody. What's it doing to the person using it though? Like, how are they doing? Like,
sure. Aristotle would
I'm
say
not
it's
saying,
bad
like-
for your soul, but we don't believe in the soul. So
Sure.
if you're going to have this is why though, if you're going to have a virtue ethic, you have to have some sort of metaphysic. You're going to have some sort of ontology, because how can you harm yourself? Like, basically, if there's the possibility of harming yourself, you need something metaphysical, unless you mean literally cutting yourself, which, if we're not talking about that, then the possibility of harming yourself requires there to be something about you as a subject that is quote unquote metaphysical or abstract, that you can
Right.
be harming, that you carry with you. You can call it mind, you can call it soul, you can call it the subject, right?
Yep.
Well, guess what? Though in our circles we talk about that all the time, in the modern world, the majority of people don't believe in any of that. They don't really believe in the subject. They believe you're just a body, you're just a brain. They don't believe in the mind. They certainly don't believe in the soul, and metaphysics is laughed out of the room. So, yeah, I think you could use Zizek. You could use there are different philosophers who can make this move to restore some sort of notion of the subject, even if it's just a pure negativity. There's at least a constant pure negativity. Like, there has to be a constant abstraction, if you will, a constant entity of which is not reducible to the physical, that you carry around with you, whatever point of space and time you're in, that is affected by your choices and actions. And if you don't believe in that, well, then it's not harming anyone. So you have no ethical weight to say you shouldn't be scrolling through your phone or sitting around doing nothing. You have to have some sort of belief that there is something about you that you carry with you that is impacted and shaped by your choices in very, very consequential and real ways.
Yeah, and I was thinking as you were talking about that, I mean, that's also very particular.
Yes.
Right? Like, the idea of, like, what it means. Like, somebody could look like they're doing nothing, but they're thinking about, like, the next greatest whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
You just never know.
Yes.
And so you can't really say, like, oh, well, that, obviously there are maybe things that you could have as a rubric or
Yes.
something like that, but it does come down to this sort of, like, there's something that's sort of strangely, I think a lot of times, like, the virtues are thought of as these kind of, like, platonic forms
Yes.
that are just,
Yes.
they're just kind of, like, imposed on everybody and stuff. But it's like, no, there's actually a lot of this very particular relation to them in the terms of what the cultivation of that looks like for you. Now, generally, again, there are rubrics of, like, what do we mean by patience, et cetera,
Sure.
et cetera, et cetera. But your patience and what you have to be patient about is different than what, Bob has to be patient about.
That's correct.
And so it's this very kind of almost an intimacy with that virtue,
Yes.
right? Which then has, in a sense, the same kind of, like, result, like, not the result. It has a type of effect in the world or something like that, right?
Yes.
But you can't really ever say what that is, except that it is something that, obviously the virtues are toward, the three virtues of, like, beauty, truth, and goodness, right? So it's like there's something about it, this particularity and intimacy with the virtue that is very much a part of, I think, this cultivation, because, yeah, just to get back to this idea of, like, it's very difficult to determine, oh, that person is just sitting around doing nothing, because what if they're
Sure, I mean,
contemplating,
Aristotle would not invite us to judge other
Right,
people,
right.
but
But
he
that's the thing,
sure
it's
as
like,
heck
look at
would.
yourself.
Yes, he
what
would
are you
sure as,
doing?
but that's why the internal discernment.
Yeah.
But you would have to have that ability to engage in that internal discernment. No, part of the problem is we can't. The reason why I don't like calling it virtue ethics, even though that's the official term, is because people hear virtue, they hear Platonic forms and the virtues, and it gets dismissed.
It always has to have that, like.
Yeah, it has this kind of it's the same with frankly, it's a problem with the word metaphysic. If you use the word metaphysic, but I don't see how you don't, I mean, it gets thrown out. But the problem is as well, we think about virtues as, oh, they're just good to do, because then Santa will bring you more presents. They also get linked with a notion of, like, rewards and punishment and
Absolutely.
a divine structure.
Absolutely.
So when people hear that, it's a lot of people are like, well, that's selfish, because you're just doing this because you want to go to heaven.
Yeah, or, like, manipulative.
It's
you're
manipulative, and therefore utilitarianism is more outward, and you're looking outward. And there can be truth to that critique, but the issue is when you start talking about values and what do you value, now we're bringing it into a risk language, a language of you taking risk and choosing, I believe this is valuable, therefore courage. It talks about you creating value, valuing yourself, valuing others, seeing value in the world. Now we start moving into, and this is what Aristotle meant But you see, the problem is we miss this whole layer because we're thinking about the virtues. So we miss all of that.
Right, and we think about it purely in terms of like, you know, like we think about it purely in terms of just sort of, it can get kind of usurped by heavy moralized type of language, when really it was always about kind of like being able to live in a fuller sense. And that fullness, like you said, could be thought of as selfish, but ultimately, if the whole idea of wanting to do the most good for the most people is so everyone can live the fullest life, right? The fullest life in the sense of being able to, you know, like that's why it has to be tied to virtues in many respects, because again, just having enough food and a house, it doesn't, you know, how's your relationship with your dad, or like, you know what I mean, like those things matter so much. That's why people who are really, you know, who have everything they could possibly ever want still take their lives, unfortunately.
Yes.
And it's like, so it has to be tied to the virtues, because, you know, in terms of living, and again, like, what does it mean to live a full life? That's, again, going to be, in a sense, particular, but also in a sense, most people would rather be, you know, given a hug than slapped. You know what I mean? Like, there are certain things that, like, there's that you know, there's a sense of what that means in terms of, like, we can all understand it's going to be different for each person, but what it means to have, like, a wonderful day, right? You know, and how that, like, what that means is related to the sense of the fullness of life in your own experience. That's tied to this very, I want to say this kind of, like, intrinsic ability to see joy and experience wonder, you know?
A few things. One, all of this conversation also suggests what is needed to fight negativity, or to face negativity, as you were speaking with Cadell. If you do not have the ability to see value, and to value yourself, you are not going to be able to face negativity. Yep. Now, that's still, you know, there's a lot of questions to be asked on that, but that should be noted. Yep. The other thing that is extremely important is that for Plato, certainly Aristotle, virtue is about beauty. It is about being beautiful. And basically, without virtue, you can't be inspired, and you can't inspire. You cannot be someone who goes into a room and inspires other people. And you yourself will not be able to inspire yourself to act and to carry yourself in the world in a manner that is full of life. Like, we don't make a connection between virtue and inspiration. We don't make a connection between value and inspiration, because we're thinking about virtues in terms of, you know, getting all the check marks on a list. But it's tied to inspiration. It's tied to being a beatific vision and seeing beauty and being beautiful for other people. Like, communities don't last if the members are not inspiring to one another, if there's not a feeling of inspiration that comes in being in the presence of one another. And precisely, it is a right-ordered soul that is capable of inspiring and being inspired, because people that tend to inspire are inspired themselves. You know, it is not the case that people tend to be inspiring who themselves go home and are dead inside and bored, right? You know, inspiration tends to be infectious. It tends to spread. Well, inspiration is basically like it's like the gift of the gods. Like, there's a term for this in classical, that, like, that spark, that alive, is only possible in a well-ordered soul. So you can't be inspiring or inspired without the virtues. And that would mean values. And that would mean living for values. And choosing values. And seeing values. And then, of course, allocating your time and your choices accordingly. So a lot of this gets tied into beauty and inspiration. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, there's a part of me that wonders, you know, for somebody who's like a well-ordered soul, you know, again, like, the idea, like, there might be many people who are like, what do you mean soul? Like, we're bodies, we're people, like, I guess...
Aristotle has answers for all of this, but we don't even begin the inquiry. Like, you have to first make clear that you can't avoid those questions. If you get someone asking what you just asked, you've won. Like, you've gone a long way. Like, you've gotten them out of the zeitgeist of the age. Like, if they seriously are asking that, not from a sort of deconstructive, dismissive way, but if they're seriously saying, okay, Dan and Michelle, that all makes sense. Well, what is a soul and what is a well-ordered soul? Bam! We're out of the autonomous utilitarianism mindset.
That's true. But it's kind of funny, though, because, like, to say, you know, we want the greatest good for the greatest number, you've decided something's good.
Yes.
Right? So it's like, you can't possibly think that just, I mean, where does that come from?
It comes from the facticity. Like, it's easy to say if you say reducing pain. So they say, well, how can you argue with that?
Good.
But now, of course, even in the obvious, there's actually an evaluation there.
It's
like,
good
why is it good to reduce pain? Yeah, exactly.
Right. You decide good.
But they would just say, come on. Like, this is where their defense at that point is just the everyday. They're like, come on, guys. Clearly pain is bad. They would use it's just practical, it's just common sense sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's a perfectly fine argument.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's going to set you up to not be able to, in a first world nation where you can't have, like, facticity organize your actions, know what to do. But no, you're exactly right, that even if you say reducing pain is good, you've made a value judgment. And if you say, come on, guys, it's common sense, well, your metaphysical framework is common sense then. Like, you can't
exactly.
avoid
like,
it.
You have some framework,
yes.
Call it common sense.
Yes, you just
Where does
can't
your
avoid
common
it.
sense come from, though?
G more, that's fine. Exactly.
Yeah,
what is the basis for it?
Where does that come, like, did that just something did you just encounter that,
Yes.
Or is that something that came out from within you or something like that,
No, exactly. Well, and the other big point that I think is really important, because earlier you were saying, we suggested if everyone just went home and took care of their kids like Mother Teresa said, everything would be great, right? Like, the world would be a much better place. Basically, under a utilitarian framework, the family is always selfish. Like, if you're focused on the family, you are not doing nearly as much good as you could do if you went to a corporate job somewhere and provided a product that made thousands of people's lives better because they didn't have to do something. Like, utilitarianism almost always has to be anti-family. And I think you see this. Like, there's definitely, like, the notion of having kids is selfish because you're taking up resources, but then also your family is 4 people or whatever, 5 people or whatever. Well, that's always smaller than the total population. So there's always going to be a feeling in the family of this not being ethical. And you could be doing more if only you were helping others. Ironically, the irony of this is that if everyone focused on their family, then so many of these problems would be taken care of. But precisely the ethic of utilitarianism can make you look outward from the family, which then causes the family to crumble to make it seem like you were right to look outward from the family.
Well, right. And I think there's a lot of times these ideas that, it's kind of like these injustices to right and everything, which, understandably so. Like, I can understand why there'd be a passion for,
sure,
for justice and these things. That's but there's a way in which, like you're saying, to your point, there's kind of the unintended consequence is not realizing the very humble beginnings of injustices, and the very humble beginnings.
Yes.
That are actually quite powerful. I don't mean humble in the bad sense.
Yes.
I mean humble in the power of that word, actually, is the family.
Yes.
And, like, I've probably mentioned it before, but I remember watching a video about, like, some mom and her kids having to be, like, getting caught up in basically, like, slave labor.
Yes.
And it was all because it all started because her husband left them.
Yes.
And she was desperate, looking for a way to get money.
Yes.
And I'm just like, it just hit me like a ton of bricks, like, that day. That day, it was like, if he had done something that was very humble, actually, it would have been so powerful. Like, I'm not saying that maybe he would have been abusive. Who knows? We don't know.
Yes.
But the point of the matter is, if he had said, I made a promise, I'm going to stay and take care of my wife and my children, she would not have to be out there looking for a job.
Yes.
She would not have been put in that vulnerable position.
Yes.
And, now people could say, like, well, see, that's the whole family structure in the first place. Why is she dependent on him? Blah, 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 blah.
Sure.
And I understand that. I get that. But we are, as humans, we have needs. There are children, and I think we've lost total touch with this, because if you don't see children and how much they need help every single day with very little things until they can do it themselves, you just think, oh, we're all these, like, 20-something autonomous people who can just do everything ourselves. Yes. Why would anyone need help? Why would I ever need a man? Why would I ever need a woman? Or why would... Well, guess what? We all are actually very needy and have, in a sense like that, we have needs.
Yes. And
we are in a context, we are in a nexus of human beings. And so... it's funny because it's like, we're going to go and help the world, and yet we don't want to think about help in the family context, and to me it's just like, it's interesting because, again, like if and again, this is a total, like, utopic vision or something, or like Rainbow Land. But like, if somehow every family was actually respectful, loving, caring, safe, a safe place, and that people knew what the hermeneutics of that were and all shared that, the world would not be a disaster, you know? There would not be the disaster and the horror of it. You know, you may still have like untimely deaths or, you know, natural
Droughts
disasters or something. But for the most part, you would have like a far better world, you know? And that's huge. Like, that is a really big thing.
The number one indicator of all sociological trouble is broken family.
But see, the thing is, like you said, once again, I can sympathize because with the idea that, well, look, family just ends up going to heck anyways. Like, it's just dysfunctional, it's traumatic, it's horrible. So screw that. We're just going to not have families anymore, and we'll just be autonomous individuals. That's fine, but I'm not sure like how the world, like how much longer society can go on with that.
But the dysfunctional family is due to the missing of the value ethics
and the virtues and such things, right? And that's the thing.
So
it's
it's
like,
a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's kind of like families are dysfunctional, so let's not have families anymore. Again, I sympathize, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that there's no potential for a family to actually be a loving, wonderful place. Because guess what? You find, like, let's say somebody's in a dysfunctional family, they actually usually tend to find a family somewhere else, right? They find their family with their friends. So people still have a desire and a need for that, and they're going to go find it elsewhere, you know? So it's like even if you want to deconstruct the family, you still have family in other forms, in other manners. But you can't get away from this idea. I mean, I guess you could theoretically, but you know, you either it really has a lot of bearings on procreation and you know, family and having children, because like you said, utility is just going to be like, no, too much of a risk, which is weird because that's even a valuation, right? To say it's too, you know, it's too much of a, you know what I mean? Even to say it's selfish to have a family, that's a valuation, right? So and then but I mean, again, I can sympathize, but it's ultimately, it's weird. It's the greatest good for the greatest number, and ultimately, like the ultimate trajectory of that line of thought, though, is to like not have humans anymore. It's like no more babies, no more people. Not, you know? So I mean, which I tongue in cheek with that. I mean, it's kind of scary, but also, you know.
I do not think it is by chance that in the West, where we have no value ethics, that now you hear basically people like, you know, it'd been better if we stayed hunter-gatherers, our agriculture was a mistake, which basically means society was a mistake. Then basically a lot of talk of environmentalism that's like, human action is bad, humans are destroying the biosphere and going to kill us all. And then you have antinatalism, which is that birth is evil. Like, you have all of these forms of thought. And I'm not saying that utilitarianism necessarily leads into that or intends any of that. But the issue is that by utilitarianism not giving you any sort of equipment by which to make right action in situations where the facticity does not tell you what to act, where you have to make judgments for yourself, then you can't discern right action. And if you can't discern right action, then it seems right not to act. And then maybe not to be capable of action at all. Ergo to not exist.
Exactly. And I mean, look, like I you know, I think about Brothers Karamazov. I think about, like, you know, the scene with the children, and that's probably one of the most difficult things to square. You know, and the difficult things to really face is, you know, just horrendous treatment of the most vulnerable. It's just like how you know, like this is this cannot be. I don't want this to happen. But look, like, you have two choices, right? You either end it all, end everything, or we're here, and what are we going to do about it? You know, what can we do to bring some hope, some light, some sense of redemption? I mean, well, so that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's tempting for anyone to just be like, because we're very, like, as humans, we're just like, yeah, just blow it all up. You know, we have, like, it takes so long to build something, and then you just come and you can just knock it down in a second. So we have, in some ways, it's very much, it fits in with our brain to just say, because it seems easier, right? And then it seems like it might be the most moral decision, because then it just ends suffering once and for all, you know?
Utilitarianism. So this is it. Utilitarianism is a kind of easier...
Not that I agree with that, but just saying...
Utilitarianism is a kind of easier moral philosophy than value ethics, because your facticity tells you what to do. Well, when it comes time to move out of utilitarianism, because it would be overfitting, and then employ value ethics, that's hard. don't know how to do that. It's existential.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just blow it all up, actually. Forget it. Or we'll just get out of the way, or we'll just spend all our time apologizing for being rich. Like, there's all these kind of death drives that come to play. Like, like, maybe prosperity was a mistake. Maybe it's immoral to be prosperous. So then there could be self-flagellation, like performative. You talked about, like, victim, like, all of these different things come out. None of this is an act in which a human being chooses values. They're all actions according to a utilitarian framework, whether they realize it or not. Because there's no choice of the positive. It's all like what you have today is people acting in the negative. Like, this is bad. These people are bad. Like, it's all negative. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Injustice is bad, therefore stop injustice. Okay, well, what is justice? I don't know. Okay, these people are bigots. Don't be bigots. Okay, well, who is a good person? Well, I don't know. Like, it's someone who's...
it's like, well, it's obvious, but there's never a definition
No, they say
of
it's
what
obvious.
The
obvious is it's someone who doesn't cause harm. It's someone who doesn't hurt other people. Okay, that's negative. What does it mean to have character? Guess what they're going to say? Stuff that means you're a good frickin' person and employee of capitalism. Like, that's what ends up happening. The value of the positive is just captured by the system. And it's how the system defines, and the results. So you are a good person if you are productive according to a capitalist structure. That's what ends up happening if you're not paying attention. That's what kind of slips in, and so you end up captured by the system. Which, of course, if you're dealing with the modern capitalism that is corporatism and crony capitalism and corporatism and all these different things, that's a problem. Now, obviously, there are defenses of capitalism, and we can go through all that. But what is happening is people don't realize it. Without a value ethics, the positives of what it means to live a good life and to have character will be defined by the system. And you won't even realize it. I mean, the other problem is, with the other reason why utilitarianism is a problem, not only does it make basically having a family unethical, or it makes, let's put it this way, it makes the ethics of family unclear. It's not clear why it is ethical, why it is creating value, because we don't believe in value, basically. We believe in doing the most good for the most people. And basically that creates an excuse for, say, men to go focus on their job and not care about their family because they're doing the most good for the most people, because they're working at a job that, like, I'm always amazed at how much corruption there is in nonprofits. Like, nonprofit organizations are full to the brim of corruption. But why should we care? Because they're doing the most good for the most people. If they're corrupt individuals, that doesn't matter, though. Right? You see, you don't have, like, it all becomes the organizational results. There's so much corruption in nonprofits. There's so much, like, bad people that run altruism organizations or different things. Mm-hmm. Well, that's because we don't really have a robust ethical theory to say why it's bad for the guy who runs the cancer organization to be in an affair. That's not necessarily bad. In fact, he's a good person. Look at all the good he's doing for people that have cancer. And why isn't an affair as bad if he no longer feels love in his marriage and he's not hurting anyone? You see what I'm saying? Like, it's just a mess. It's a mess. Because basically, well, here's the thing. Capitalism loves us to define ethics by results because capitalism is very effective, and once AI comes on, it's going to be super effective. And AI will become ethical because AI will definitely be able to do the most good for the most people. And so it would be ethical to replace humans with AI. And the AI conversation is another example, just like antinatalism and all that, where basically we're like, it would be better if humans were not around to act at all. Because if we're not capable of valuable action, why should we act? And so there's this, it's all very anti-human. There's so much anti-life. It's all anti-life. Yeah. Which is worse than death. Like, death, people would say death is anti-life. No, death actually is necessary for life. Yeah. This is a different spirit. This is not a spirit of death. This is a kind of anti-life spirit. It's a different thing that is very dangerous.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I mean, like, somebody might say as a counter, like, well, okay, you're captured by the system or the zeitgeist, but, aren't you just captured by the system of virtues? Like, wouldn't you just still be captured by some
No, because in Nietzsche, you have to create it. You have to be the child.
Well, like Nietzsche, but maybe in religion.
No, but Nietzsche is absolutely the modern era, like, value ethics. Like, Nietzsche, to be the child, like, Nietzsche's thinking is an extension of Aristotle's. I mean, we said at the beginning that we can't follow Aristotle in his assumptions of the ends of the polis because we live in pluralism. Right. So we're not saying to literally go back and just do what Aristotle said, but the ethical framework that he presents is unavoidable unless you're just going to be captured by the system. And by all means, if you by your own values and choices decide, I want to be an employee at Google, that's not someone who's captured. Just because you're working for a corporation, it does not follow you are necessarily captured.
Right.
The problem is this staggering, stumbling in to ways of life.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
Right, and same with like you could say that if you make your own kind of conscious decision, to be a Christian or have a certain religion, like you're being thoughtful with that.
Yes.
Like obviously there's always going to be influences, right? There's always going to be certain influences that might be that might influence you.
Yes.
Right, but I think it's good you bring up Nietzsche because it's kind of this idea of like, but can you understand that value for yourself?
Yes. Yes.
Not just to borrow it from I'm this or I'm that, so therefore in a way it's kind of like getting out of your actual responsibility. It's kind of to sort of like put things on your political party or your religion, or instead of just being like, but what do I believe? And yes, the things you might come to and determine and really in a very meaningful way like come to as your values maybe line up with Catholicism or with like you said even like capitalism. It could even line up with that, but it's this idea of like actually not just being mindlessly captured, but rather to be thoughtful and I want to say kind of more purposeful, or I don't know, you make the distinction between will and purpose, but to basically understand and determine your own values and for yourself, and that's where the inner cultivation comes in.
Absolutely. And the key to all this is, if it is the case that you cannot be ethical without evaluation, then you cannot escape philosophy. Like, we live in an anti-philosophy world, where everyone's like, philosophy is a waste of time, it's just a hobby, you don't have to do it, why do you have to make everything so complex, just be practical, it's common sense. If you take seriously what we are saying, then philosophy is unavoidable. You will have to engage in abstract reasoning.
Right.
You will have to engage in ontology, epistemology, metaphysics. What is the human? What should the human do? Right. You can't escape it. That's another reason why utilitarianism is so dangerous, is it can create the impression that you don't need to think, you just need to observe the results. You just need to be scientific, per se, and be empirical. Like, did it reduce pain or not? There's no need for abstract reasoning or questions of what is the human being. You just see if it reduced pain or not. But in the same way that the problem with science is facts don't tell you what they mean, facts don't tell you the worldview they sit in, likewise, reducing pain doesn't tell you what making a human healthy does not tell you what the healthy human should do.
Right,
exactly. If you reduce sickness on this planet, it will not follow from this that the people who are healed will know how to live.
Yeah.
You will have to take an entirely different step of reasoning. Yeah. So if you take, and this is, Blondel really thought that if you took human action seriously, you would end up in philosophy. Like, it was impossible to examine action and not end up in philosophy. Now, he also thought you ended up in theology. Now, that's a different move, and that would be another matter. But the point is that human action requires evaluation. And if it requires evaluation, you cannot escape philosophy. And if you get that clear in your head, suddenly there are stakes. And suddenly this matters. And Aristotle will be like, yes, it does. And it would actually be unethical for you not to do it, because if you don't do it, you cannot determine what is fitting. And if you can't determine what is fitting, then you cannot be ethical. Therefore, there's an ethics to wisdom. We don't believe that it's ethical to gain wisdom. We really don't. We think it's a nicety. We think it's nice if you have it, but it doesn't matter if you don't have it. No, it matters. If we do not have it, we basically have no way to stop the forces of anti-life. We do not have an ethic today to stop the forces of anti-life. Because that would require values. That would require virtues. That would require the ability to stand for something and say, this is good, and I will do it, and I will commit to it, and it is good to be alive so that I can commit to it. Mm-hmm. Well, that would require virtue and values.
Yeah.
Without this, we cannot stop the forces of anti-life.
Yeah. And just one more thing I wanted to add was the idea of, the most good for the most people. The risk too is I was just thinking about people doing all these surveys to get the numbers anyway.
Yes.
Who's doing that survey? Who's getting those numbers? Are those I know we've already said it, but are those numbers fudged? I mean, there's just so much to it that how do you know?
You don't.
The only thing you could really know is look around you.
Yes.
Look at the people around you.
Yes.
That's really all you can know.
But this is the problem. Utilitarianism is anti-common life, because your common life will always be smaller than whatever is greater than that, and therefore ethics is directed toward people you don't know. Like,
Yeah.
almost utilitarianism is almost always directed toward the people you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, if you don't form relationships with the people you know, it's not necessarily bad. Because maybe you didn't form those because you're focused on everyone else on planet Earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? You cannot assume that someone who fails to be a member of their community or common life is therefore unethical. Whereas for Aristotle, you absolutely would conclude that, because that person does not have character. So we're not, there's no emphasis on the common life.
Yeah. One I like too, like the word character itself is great because it's kind of like, where else do you hear that word? Well, it's a character in a book,
Yes, a story.
It's in a story. So it's like you have to actually be someone that it's like you matter, and you also you're somebody who matters to other people.
Aristotle's
and
ethics.
that's the thing. A character is somebody in a book who matters. What they are part of the story, right? What they do matters because it has some function in the story.
Aristotle's ethics absolutely aligns with the phenomenology of the artist, artistic thinking, story thinking, where utilitarianism is technology, science, and things like that. Again, it is precisely because utilitarianism does such a great job of reducing poverty that it is tempting to use it as a monotheory by which to discern all human action.
Yeah.
Science works so well, same problem. The issue is if you overfit it, the consequences are dire. And we are overfitting it. And in overfitting it, by trying to discern how we should live our everyday life in a first world nation, you have no way to stop the forces of anti-life. The problem also with utilitarianism, at the end of the day, it's basically easier to join a march to fight against an injustice than it is to face the real of your family. Like Lacan, it's way easier to kind of stand up for an abstract cause or to go like, let's make America great again or whatever, or fight whatever you want, than the reality of personal relationships or facing yourself.
Absolutely.
If utilitarianism is your only ethical guide, then it is actually ethical to avoid the real. It will not necessarily be clear to you or apparent that the active avoidance that you are engaging in to avoid the real is unethical. In fact, you could be an ethical person precisely to avoid the real. So then the incentives, the ethical incentives, can be completely backwards in directing people to not be focusing on the areas of their life that they could make a difference, the common life and family. And if it is indeed the case that the world would be a radically better place if everyone focused on their families and common lives, then that ethic precisely leads you into what causes the worst of all possible worlds in the name of making the best of all possible worlds. And thus it itself is a force of the anti-life that it is unable to stand against.
Yeah. That's good.
For more by O.G. Rose, please visit YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Anchor. You can find the paper, The Value Isn't the Utility, on Medium and Substack. And thank you so much for your time.